March 7th, 1945, Remagen, Rhineland. The apartment building burned like a monument to something already dead. Flames climbed through 4 stories of timber and plaster, sending black smoke rolling across the evening sky. Inside, somewhere above the roar, children were screaming. Lieutenant James Walsh stood in the street with his rifle company, watching fire consume brick and wood with the efficiency of a crematorium. His men had cleared this block an hour ago. The mission was complete. Then Walsh heard the screaming and started running toward the fire. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're in Berlin or Boston, Tokyo or Toronto. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back to life, one voice at a time. And if this story moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Walsh was 25 years old, 8 months in combat. Normandy, France, now Germany itself. His father was a Boston fire captain who taught him that buildings burned in predictable patterns and that saving people meant acting fast and accepting risk. But his father had never taught him about this, about enemy civilians trapped in a burning building while his soldiers stood in a street they'd just taken by force. Walsh reached the entrance and stopped. The heat pushed against him like a physical wall. Smoke poured from shattered windows. From somewhere above came the sound of glass breaking, of voices screaming in German. His sergeant, Bill Torres, moved up beside him. "Orders are to secure the area," Torres said quietly, "not to conduct rescue operations." And in that moment, staring into fire that didn't care about military objectives, Walsh realized that everything about war, the strategy, the doctrine, the clean lines on maps, meant nothing when measured against the sound of children burning alive. Walsh's rifle company, part of the 9th Armored Division, pushed toward the Rhine in March 1945 as Germany collapsed. Towns were rubble, soldiers were boys and old men, yet propaganda still claimed Americans showed no mercy. Remagen guarded the Ludendorff Bridge, one of the last intact crossings. Walsh's men entered at dawn, meeting scattered resistance. Most defenders surrendered. By late afternoon, the Eastern District was in American hands. Around 6 p.m., an artillery-damaged gas line ignited. An explosion blew out windows, and flames raced through an old timber building. Walsh's platoon heard the blast and moved in cautiously. When they arrived, screaming cut through the noise, people trapped on the 3rd floor. Walsh signaled his men to stop and assess. Sergeant Torres, seasoned from North Africa and Sicily, calculated grimly. The structure had minutes before collapse. Entering meant climbing into fire and choking smoke with no gear. Walsh looked at his exhausted soldiers and chose to go. "Mitchell, Chun, Washington, with me." Private Mitchell raised around volunteer firefighters. Corporal Chun, taught to help anyone in need. And PFC Washington, raised on the belief that every life mattered, followed without hesitation. Inside was an inferno. Visibility was inches. Heat seared skin. Staying low, Walsh felt his way to the stairwell. The charred steps groaned, but held as they climbed through worsening smoke. On the 3rd floor, the screams came from a back apartment. Walsh broke the door. Inside were a mother, 2 small children, a teenage daughter, and an unconscious grandmother. The mother froze at the sight of an American uniform. Propaganda battling reality, then nodded. There was no other choice. Walsh hoisted the grandmother. Mitchell grabbed the two children. Chun guided the mother and teenager. Washington checked the room once more, then followed. The descent was brutal. The building trembled under accelerating collapse. Halfway down, the stairwell gave way. Walsh barely lunged onto the next landing, the grandmother's weight nearly pulling him down. "Move!" he shouted as debris crashed below. They pushed through collapsing heat and smoke until they burst into cold air just as the upper floors gave way in a roaring implosion. Walsh carried the grandmother to Torres's perimeter. His men stumbled out moments later with the rest of the family, coughing, burned, but alive. They had escaped with seconds to spare. Private Tony Ritchie moved fast. The grandmother was unconscious from smoke inhalation. He gave her oxygen and ordered immediate evacuation. The mother and children were shaken but stable. The teenage girl had burned hands, which Ritchie wrapped while speaking gently despite the language barrier. Walsh sat on the curb, hands trembling. Torres handed him a canteen. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen," he said. "Yeah, that building could have collapsed. Yeah, and for civilians people we've been fighting." Walsh looked up. "So I should have let them burn?" Torres hesitated. "No, I'd have done the same. Necessary, but stupid." The mother approached, soot-streaked and shaking, thanking them in rapid German. Torres translated. She'd believed Americans were cruel and couldn't understand why Walsh saved them. Walsh answered, "Tell her we don't leave people to burn." She squeezed Walsh's hand briefly. Gratitude and shock mingled before returning to her children. Captain Morrison arrived as the grandmother was loaded for evacuation. He pulled Walsh aside. "You entered a burning building without authorization. You risked your men for enemy civilians." "Yes, sir. Off the record, I'd have done the same, but understand the risk. Write a full report. Actions like this matter." They changed minds. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the battalion. Soldiers told each other about the lieutenant who'd run into a burning building to save German civilians, about children carried out moments before the structure collapsed, about the grandmother who'd have died without immediate intervention. Some approved. They'd been raised with values that said human life was sacred, regardless of circumstances. Private Mitchell's letters home to Iowa described the rescue in detail, noting his uncle, the firefighter, would have been proud. Others were ambivalent. They'd lost friends to German bullets and shells. They'd marched through destroyed French towns where German forces had fought to the last. Why risk American lives for German civilians? But even the ambivalent couldn't quite dismiss what Walsh had done, because children screaming in a burning building weren't abstract enemies. They were just people trapped by circumstances, dying in real time. And walking away from that felt like a line crossed, a point where military necessity became inhuman cruelty. German civilians of Remagen heard the story, too. It passed through the town in whispers. American soldiers had rescued the Hoffman family from the burning building, had run into fire to save German women and children, had risked their own lives for people the propaganda said they'd abuse or ignore. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything the regime had taught portrayed Americans as cruel, materialistic, degenerate. But the evidence contradicted this. Soldiers who saved civilians, who shared rations with hungry children, who provided medical care without distinction between ally and enemy. Frau Hoffman, the mother Walsh had rescued, became an informal spokesperson. She told her story to neighbors emerging slowly from cellars and hiding places as American control solidified. Described how the American lieutenant had appeared through smoke carrying her mother-in-law, how his soldiers had helped her children down burning stairs, how they'd provided medical care immediately afterward. "They could have left us," she told a gathering in a church basement that had become an impromptu community center. Military regulations probably said they should, but they didn't. They risked their lives because we were human beings in danger, and that was enough. The story spread beyond Remagen. Other towns along the Rhine heard about it. Refugees fleeing eastward carried it with them. It became one small piece of evidence in a larger transformation, the recognition that the propaganda had been fundamentally wrong, that Americans weren't monsters, but people who made moral choices under pressure. 3 weeks later, Walsh's company advanced through the ruined Ruhr. Factories were rubble, homes flattened, civilians hiding wherever they could. On April 2nd in Essen, Walsh's platoon heard faint tapping beneath a collapsed building, steady, deliberate, not military code but desperation. "Could be a trap," Shun warned. Welsh still ordered covering positions and began clearing debris with Tors. As the tapping grew louder, they uncovered an air pocket in the basement, a trapped family of 4. The father was dead, but the mother and 2 children were alive after 3 days without food or water. The girl, about 6, was unconscious, barely breathing. Walsh called Ritchie for medical aid. 4 fluids, blankets, oxygen, fast, focused work. The mother watched with stunned gratitude, unable to reconcile mercy from those she'd been taught to fear. When her daughter's breathing steadied, she began to cry silently. Captain Morrison arrived as the family was loaded onto an evacuation truck. "You're developing a habit, Lieutenant, rescuing German civilians, taking risks outside mission parameters." Walsh met his gaze. "If it's a problem, sir, I'll accept the consequences." "It's the right kind of problem," Morrison said. "Your rescues are winning more hearts and minds than combat ever could." Over the next weeks, Walsh's company adopted an unofficial rule. If civilians needed help and aiding them didn't compromise the mission, they stepped in. They pulled people from damaged buildings, shared rations with hungry children, treated injuries, and set up temporary shelters in secured areas. Other units noticed and gradually adopted similar habits. Not all some officers focused strictly on military goals, and some soldiers were too hardened by combat to care, but enough participated that a clear pattern formed. German civilians saw the difference. Propaganda insisted Americans were cruel. Reality showed soldiers handing out food. Propaganda claimed they would destroy German culture. Reality showed them protecting churches and cultural sites when possible. Propaganda warned they sought revenge. Reality showed medics treating wounded civilians and prisoners without distinction. The psychological shift was dramatic. Civilians who had been taught to fear Americans now sought them out, refugees approaching American lines for food, safety, medical care, or simply stability amid Germany's collapse. The change from enemy to occupier to something more complex happened slowly, one human interaction at a time. Walsh noticed the new reactions. At first, civilians hid or stared at the ground when soldiers approached. Now there was still caution, but also tentative hope. Children who once cowered behind adults now edged toward soldiers, curious about candy or unfamiliar accents. One evening in late April, while Walsh supervised ration distribution in a recently captured town, an elderly German man approached, speaking formal English learned long before. "Lieutenant, may I speak with you?" Of course, I want to thank you, not just for the food, though we need it, but for showing us not everything we were told was true. We believed Americans were cruel, yet you saved my neighbor's family in Remagen. You dug my cousin's children from rubble in Essen. You treat our wounded. You share rations with our hungry. This is not the enemy we were promised. Walsh had no reply. The man went on. I am ashamed I believed lies. Ashamed it took foreign soldiers showing mercy to reveal our own government deceived us. You are better men than we were told, better than we deserved. We're just doing what's right, Walsh said. Yes, doing what is right when doing wrong would be easier. That matters more than you know. Not every rescue ended well. On April 18th, Walsh's platoon entered a collapsed, burning factory to reach civilians trapped on the third floor. While helping them out, Private Mitchell guided a woman over debris when the floor collapsed beneath him. He fell 12 feet onto rebar and concrete, his leg shattered, metal driven through his thigh. Walsh and Chun reached him fast. Walsh applied a tourniquet while Chun called for evacuation. Mitchell had been injured saving a German civilian from a building destroyed by Allied bombing. He survived, underwent surgery, and was sent home with a medical discharge. He would walk with a limp for life, a reminder of the woman he saved. The incident forced Walsh to confront whether he was risking his men too much. He visited Mitchell, apologizing for sending him in. Mitchell, groggy but firm, refused the apology. Would you have left the family? When Walsh said no, Mitchell answered, Then you didn't ask me to do anything you wouldn't do. Some risks are worth it. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. During occupation duties, Walsh's rescue efforts were recognized. He received a commendation for humanitarian actions under fire, evacuating civilians in multiple cities, proving Americans could be effective and decent. After the small Frankfurt ceremony, Frau Hoffmann waited outside with her children. We are alive because you ran into fire for us, she said softly. I wanted to thank you properly. You're welcome. I'm glad you're all well. It is more than that. You changed how I understand the world. Everything I was taught said you would hurt us, that Americans were dangerous, but you saved us. You risked your life for people who were supposed to be your enemy. That broke something in me, broke the propaganda, broke the lies. Now I teach my children that nationality matters less than character, that enemies can show mercy, that systems can be wrong even when they claim to be absolutely right. She handed him a small package wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a wooden carving of a bird, skillfully made, simple but beautiful. My husband, who died in the war, he made these. I want you to have one, to remember that we remember. What you did mattered. Walsh accepted the carving carefully. Thank you. I'll keep it. Will you go home now, to America, eventually? After occupation duties are complete, tell them. Tell Americans that what you did here, the mercy you showed, it changed people's minds. It helped us see beyond the lies. That matters for whatever Germany becomes next. Walsh returned to Boston in January 1946. He took over his father's fire department position, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, lived what looked from outside like an ordinary life. But he kept the wooden bird carving on his desk, and when his children asked about it, he told them about Germany, about the burning building, about choosing to help people who were supposed to be the enemy. Why did you do it? His daughter asked when she was 12. They were Germans. Weren't they the bad guys? Walsh considered how to explain something complex to a child raised in peacetime. The German government was bad. The regime started the war, did terrible things. But individual people, women and children, trapped in burning buildings, they weren't responsible for their government's actions. They were just people who needed help. Walking away from that would have made me less human, but it was dangerous. You could have died, yes, but letting them die when I could save them, that would have been worse. Because then I'd have to live knowing I chose convenience over conscience. His daughter thought about this. Did they understand? The people you saved? Some did, eventually. They'd been taught I was the enemy, that Americans were cruel. But actions speak louder than propaganda. When you save someone's life, that changes the equation. Do you think it mattered in the big picture? Walsh looked at the carved bird. I know it mattered to Frau Hoffmann and her family. Beyond that, ... he shrugged. Germany had to be rebuilt somehow. Maybe having Germans who understood that Americans could show mercy made that easier. Maybe it didn't, but I didn't do it for strategic reasons. I did it because it was right. Over the years, Walsh received letters from Germany. Frau Hoffmann wrote every Christmas, updating him on her children, describing the country's reconstruction, and reminding him that she taught her family about the American lieutenant who saved them, proof that moral choices mattered even in war. In 1965, her daughter, once the teenager pounding on the burning window, came to America for university and visited Walsh in Boston. Now, studying architecture, she told him, "My mother says the day you ran into the fire was when she realized that propaganda was false. People mattered more than ideology." She added that her mother now taught school, using her experience to warn students about dehumanization and unquestioned authority. Before leaving, she said, "She wants you to know you didn't just save our lives. You saved our belief in human decency." Lieutenant James Walsh died in 1998 at 78. At his funeral, alongside family and veterans, stood Frau Hoffmann, now in her 80s, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She spoke. "We were supposed to be enemies, but he saw people who needed help, and that changed my life." His mercy rippled through generations. Walsh's children later donated his commendation and the Hoffmann letters to the National World War II Museum, where they remain a quiet file in an archive, evidence that even amid devastation, individuals could choose humanity over ideology. Researchers who encounter the story today see how such acts weakened propaganda, aided reconstruction, and proved that soldiers could choose compassion even when war pushed them toward hate. Walsh didn't change the war's outcome, but he changed its meaning for those he saved and those who learned from them. His legacy lives in the generations shaped by one moment of courage, a reminder that moral choices echo far beyond the moment they're made.